London, 1665. The air hung thick with the scent of rotting timber and unwashed flesh. A city swelling at the seams with the moans of the dying and the silence of the son to be dead. He was 20, with hands too delicate for stone, and eyes that looked upon the world as though it might vanish if he stared too long. A single word, carved with a shaking hand. Deliverance. Not a name. A plea. Elias did not open it, not yet. He simply stood, transfixed. Was that the plague had not yet returned, it had awakened, and it had waited centuries to be heard again. And when he returned above, he did not speak of it. The Black Death was no longer a whisper from the past, it was a scream in every household. But this time, the sickness did not spread in the way they remembered. It struck first in silence. Hallucinations, violent fits of weeping. Her name was Margaret Bellamy, a physician's widow with no children, and nothing left to fear. But not quiet. From within, the air trembled with something ancient, as though the earth itself were breathing through clenched teeth. Margaret stood before it, felt her skin prickle, her vision blur. She did not scream. She simply knelt and whispered the words her husband had scrawled in the margins of his last entry. What was buried with hunger returns with thirst. She found Elias' name buried in a municipal logbook, his death marked as Pestilentia Ignota. She traced the property deeds back to the alehut, now long since razed, but she found the cracked foundation stone, the broken wall beneath. And she descended. She had nursed her husband as he died, screaming, holding his hand as it bled through the sheets. She had watched the neighbors vanish one by one, and in the stillness of her empty home, she read his journals filled with strange diagrams, feverish inkwork of veins curling into knots and lungs turned inside out, all of them centered on one note. Origin lies below. Dreams of earth-swallowing sky. Then the bleeding began. From the eyes, the ears, the mouth. Not the swellings of old, but something far more cruel. Doctors could not explain it. Clergy refused to speak its name. Some claimed it was the devil's version of the pestilence, sharpened and refined through time like a blade waiting in the dark. But he began to change. Elias had been ordered by his master to tear down the southern wall of an abandoned alehouse. His skin grew grey as old parchment. He muttered in his sleep nonsense, at first, then fragments of Latin, though he'd never learnt a letter of it. Behold, the man who... The other apprentices whispered, then avoided him. A week later, the mason's foreman found Elias dead in his coat eyes open, mouth filled with black fluid, fingers curled as though clutching something unseen. They burned his belongings and salted the floorboards. But it was too late, because 3 days after Elias first touched that coffin, the rats began to flee the alleys, and the children stopped laughing, scheduled for demolition to make way for a plague pit. The foundation cracked easily, revealing beneath it a stairwell of stone, a crypt, though no records showed such a place. The air that exhaled from the darkness stank of copper and mold, and yet Elias, drawn not by duty, but by the strange hum that filled his ears the moment he exposed the chamber, descended. Yet, deep beneath the cobbled arteries of Whitechapel, beneath the carriages and beggars, beneath the shrill cries of street orphans and the shuffle of booth-heels, there lay something older, something sealed not with reverence, but with haste. A coffin, nameless and crude, sunk into the wet earth behind an unmarked wall choked by mud, or so they thought. The man who first touched it was not a doctor, nor a scholar, but a mason's apprentice named Elias Kettering. By candlelight, he found it. The coffin, simple, pine-stained, dark with something other than age, bound by rusted iron bands. He stopped eating. What the city would not see, could not bear to imagine. In the months that followed, and still, none looked beneath Whitechapel. But one did. Margaret followed the trail of records, letters, rumors. She found the coffin, untouched, and then, from the silence, she heard it, a sound not meant for ears. A wet rustle, a fingernail against wood. The coffin was not empty. It never had been. Margaret Bellamy did not flee, even as the candle in her hand flickered against the stone, even as the air thickened like clotting blood. She remained kneeling before the coffin, but it lingered in the bones, that subtle scrape from within, as if Neil's rotted ancient had moved, not to escape, but to listen. She moved like a vessel emptied and refilled with something colder. She spoke little, slept less, and always, in her mind, the vision returned. The coffin beneath Whitechapel, pulsing faintly in the dark, as if breathing in her memory. Margaret reached out, almost absently, and touched the iron band. It was cold, but not dead. She felt something beneath it, a warmth like fevered skin. It was a prison, not out of terror, but because for a single moment the coffin had felt alive. It was what he said last, before casting her out with ashes smeared on her brow. You should never have gone alone. It knows you now. Her breath came shallow, not from fear, but from something else, something older than instinct. She lit a circle of candles, sat at its center, and wept not for herself, but for what she had brought. Not in words, in hunger, a body not buried, but sealed inside a second coffin identical to the one in Whitechapel ironbound, pine-stitched, and marked only with a sigil no one could read. When opened, the body within was not decayed. It was fresh, eyes open, mouth sewn shut with golden wire. A woman, a hunger she felt inside her own skin, curling up from the marrow. She had not eaten in 2 days. Now she craved something raw, still closed, still breathing, and in the dust beside it, a new word appeared. Something still warm, and as the wind howled through the keyholes and the candle flames shivered against shadows that moved without source, she whispered into the dark. Reverence, or perhaps recognition. The noise had ceased, not missing, just gone, not merely by contact, but by presence. Entire homes wilted overnight. Lamps burned cold, and in alleyways at dusk, children spoke to shadows with no voice. They began to hum songs no one remembered teaching them, songs in tongues older than English, songs that made grown men vomit. Her home stood untouched, doors locked from the inside. Nobler her face was the same, her hands folded in peace. Yet her fingernails were clogged with blood. Her lips had bite marks. From the inside, only a smear of blackened footprints leading to the basement, and then nothing. That night, London trembled. A fog rolled in, thicker than coal smoke, carrying with it a smell that clawed at memory, something like burnt sugar and bile. Dogs wailed. Not to open his, she did not dare but to watch, to observe the thing that had no right to exist, and yet had endured. On the 7th night, she found a rat, gutted and dry, placed neatly beside the coffin like an offering. On the 8th, a child's rag doll, soaked through with something black. There were no footsteps, no signs of life, only tokens, left as if in worship. Milk soured in its bottles. The dead, already buried, were said to turn in their graves. In the days that followed, Margaret changed. She no longer walked the streets as a widow. She returned, night after night. Margaret, in desperation, turned to Father Whitcomb, the last priest in Shoreditch, who still dared bless the dead. She told him what she had seen. He listened with trembling lips, then asked a single question. "Did you dream of the worms?" She had. Whitcomb's face fell pale. He told her of an old rite, forbidden even in his seminary. A rite used not to bury, but to bind a sealing of something not dead, but starving. There were rumors, passed only in whispers among certain Jesuit circles, of a plague not born from nature, but summoned from rot. A parasite of the soul, awakened only when man forgets how to fear the dark. The coffin, he said, was not a grave, and someone or something had begun to feed again. But what terrified Margaret most was not the law, nor the priest's trembling hands. That evening, Margaret locked every door, boarded every window, and something answered. The next morning, Margaret Bellamy was gone, not dead, but something else was found. That same week, grave diggers unearthed a corpse behind the church of St. Dunstan in East Margaret. But she had not aged. She had not been buried alive. She had been transformed. And still, the plague grew worse. And, beneath Whitechapel, in the damp crypt that no one dared claim, the coffin waited. In the heart of London, where the fog refused to lift and the Thames ran thick as oil, a silence began to grow. Not the kind born of reverence, nor of sleep, but a silence that watched. A silence that waited. It gathered beneath eaves, behind shutters, between the ticks of clocks. It was as if the city itself were holding its breath. Then came the bells. Leeches turned to ash. Bleed-in accelerated the sickness. One surgeon, desperate, attempted to remove the lungs of a still-living patient, hoping to cut the disease free from the body. What he found instead was unspeakable. The lungs were not inflamed but hollow, hollowed from the inside, as if something had been nesting. The coffin was placed beside the original, wax stripped onto the floor in a perfect circle. And then they waited, until the screaming stopped. On the 1st of October, at precisely midnight, the ancient bell of St. Magnus, no wind stirred, no hand pulled its rope. One closed. Below it, 7 other names, each belonging to a child that had vanished that month. Yet the toll echoed across the sleeping streets, like a shiver through flesh. Those who heard it would later swear the sound was not made of metal, but of teeth on bone. And then, the coughing began. It started in the throat. Entire neighborhoods heard lullabies in the walls, and still, the fog would not lift. A dry rasp, like sand. Then the fever came hot enough to blister the skin. Those afflicted clawed at their own faces, murmuring about the hallway without doors and the feast in the earth. Within 3 days, their eyes turned black. Within 5, they were gone. But their bodies did not rot. The physicians were baffled. Not violently, not publicly, but thoroughly. Their clothes remained folded, their shoes by the door, their beds still warm. But they themselves were erased. A man in a coat that did not catch the rain, tall, pale, and walking with a lantern whose flame burned downward. He went door to door, not asking for coin, nor for confession, but for names. He hanged himself that same evening, gathered without word or gesture. They bore no torches. Their eyes were sewn shut, churches emptied, bells were silenced, and in the catacombs of Whitechapel, beneath the rotting boards and weeping stones, a third coffin appeared, identical waiting, and yet they moved with certainty. Even in Babylon always, when the earth forgot how to bury its dead. He was not a man, he was a reminder. They carried with them a second coffin, identical to the first. But this one screamed. Parliament, ever reluctant to believe what they could not tax or kill, ordered the crypt of Whitechapel sealed and forgotten. But the order came too late, for below the city, the hunger had begun to multiply. In the flickering corridors of the old catacombs abandoned since the plague pits of 1665, a strange procession took place. Men in robes, stitched from plague, Dr. Leathers, a child was inside. Witnesses those few mad or cursed enough to have seen spoke of a ritual, not to summon death, but to feed it. When the crypt was later discovered, by a group of Firewatch volunteers hoping to extinguish the outbreak from beneath, they found only ash, and 2 coffins, one missing. The name Margaret Bellamy was scratched into the wall. And the word, too. It was no longer a whisper, it was a countdown. The city cracked. Streets warped underfoot. Horse hooves bled from stones that grew hot. Time-fractured bells rang before the hour. Milk curdled before it was poured. Then came the collector. He arrived without announcement. People gave them willingly. He carried no book, yet he remembered each one, and those he named vanished. No one questioned the collector, because everyone remembered him, even if they had never seen his face before. It was said he had once walked in Rome, in Constantinople, and the list grew shorter. Soon only a few dared speak above a whisper. Was still wet, etched into its lid, burned by hand, was a phrase in Latin, Venter Orbis, the belly of the city. And beside it, as if scrawled by something too large to hold a pen, 3. They say, the city remembers, not in words, nor in stone, but in a way deeper than time, like an old wound that never quite healed. By the final days of that cursed winter, London no longer breathed. The air itself had thickened, turned sour, dogs refused to bark, and the birds once countless upon the rooftops had vanished entirely, as if the streets had begun to decay from the inside out. Children no longer cried, not from the graveyards, but from beneath the floorboards, the drains, a sound of claws on clay, as if something long buried had remembered its own name and was clawing its way home. Only the sound of digging remained. She no longer prayed. She only waited, rocking gently in her chair, as if cradling something no one else could see. She remembered the inside of the coffin lined, not with silk, but with something living, something that pulsed when no one looked directly at it. She remembered the whisper that came from within, a whisper not meant for ears, but for blood. It came at night. At the center of it all, in the narrowing spiral of madness, stood Margaret Bellamy. She had not slept in 17 nights. Her eyes were black with veins, her fingers raw from tracing symbols into the walls of her rented flat. She no longer ate. It was grown, like fungus, from rot. She reached forward not in fear, but in surrender, and touched the lid, like thought from regret. A laugh, long and slow and hollow, like wind through a ribcage. Its wood pulsed. His coat clung to him like wet skin, but still, he smiled. Its iron nails wept rust, and it waited at the base of St. Magna's bell tower, where no bell had rung in weeks, nor into dust but into paper, page by page, each covered in inkless names that burned the eye to red, where no priest dared kneel. Walls cracked, Gasp. Across the Thames, the tower itself groaned, as if something ancient had turned over in its sleep. Because Margaret knew what the city had forgotten. Spires crumbling, bridges cracking, 1,000 faces screaming in perfect silence, and above it all, not the sky but a fifth coffin, floating, massive, lidless. She had been in the room when the first coffin was opened. She remembered the smell not of death, but of return. It had said, 4 must sleep, then 1 will wake. And now, the 4th had come. The new coffin was not delivered. Margaret stood before it. Her breath fogged the air like a lantern's dying light. It was warm. Far beneath cobblestones slick with forgotten blood, sound began again. Then, the bell rang. Not once, but 4 times. Each toll shook the city like thunder, and from beneath the city came a sound not meant for any century. The collector appeared for the last time. No longer tall, no longer silent, he stumbled now, as if drunk on memory. His lantern had gone dark. For his list was complete. The names were gone, not crossed out, not erased but consumed. Margaret Bellamy watched him crumble not into ash, and when he was gone, the 4th coffin opened. There was no body inside, only a mirror that reflected not the church, but a city on fire, not flames, but teeth, rows upon rows of them, rising like cathedrals, consuming the skyline. Whiting and Margaret, she stepped inside, not because she was chosen, but because she understood that the city had never been built upon rock or soil, but upon hunger, that beneath every stone lay a name, that every name was a key, and that every key had now turned. As the lid closed, the mirror shattered, and silence returned. But this silence was different. It did not wait, it did not watch, it slept. And somewhere far beneath the weight of centuries, a breath, a heartbeat, and knock 5 in you, dear listener, you just heard it too. Some cities are built on bones. London was built on something deeper, something that remembers.